Aloha and welcome. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about function arguments. We've kind of hinted at it a little bit before in our discussion of scopes, but function arguments, if you remember, are the values that are passed into functions. They're mapped to parameters that are listed in your function definition. So arguments to functions are passed by what we call object reference. Object reference is sometimes referred to in Python as pass by assignment. So new variables are going to be created in a function's local namespace by binding the names to passed arguments. So essentially, when you pass in, let's say you're calling your function, you're passing in a value, that value is going to be bound to the names that are given in the parameters. So whether or not the changes that you make to that parameter is visible outside the function, it depends on the mutability of the thing that you just passed in. So if you remember, mutability is the ability to change something. So if you have an immutable object, you cannot make changes to it. If you have a mutable object, you can. So examples of immutable objects would be like strings. Example of a mutable object is going to be list. So when you're passing in these arguments, if the argument is immutable, like a string, a new object is going to be created to the local scope. If the object is mutable, like a list, then the changes that you make to that list are going to persist outside the function. So if you need a mutable argument to be unmodified at the global scope, just send a copy of that mutable object in. So I'm going to set up an example here. So let's bear with me while I pull up, let's see, while I pull up VS Code. Where is that? Okay, so here is VS Code right now. So we're going to go ahead and set up a function first of all. So we'll say define, and as always, my function, and we're going to, let's have X as our handy dandy parameter there, and we're going to do something like, well, let's not do anything for now. Let's just pass. So then we're going to go and we're going to set up an object, let's say a mutable object here. So we're going to go with my list equals 0, 1, 2, 3. So how does that sound? So we've got my list set up with that, and we're going to just print out my list. Okay, and then we're going to call on my function, and we're going to send it my list. So now that I have an idea of what I want to do up here, just to test and see what happens to the thing that we have here, I'm going to make a change. I'm going to change the first element to the phrase hi. So we're going to print out the list. It'll give us this. I'm going to call on my function, and then in that function, I'm going to assign it. So now let's see whether or not that change persists at the top level. So if we go ahead here and we hit play, we'll see that, all right, so we start off, we print out the list 0, 1, 2, 3, then we run our function, and then we reprint it again, and sure enough, the 0th object, the 0th element has been changed to hi. So if my list, let's say, was an actual list, let's go ahead and comment that out. Let's say it was an immutable thing, like let's say my list, call it a list. It's not really a list at this point. We're just going to say it's string. Now it's going to happen here. This will be interesting. So when we hit it, yeah, we're going to get an error because we're trying to reference 0, and we're trying to put 2 things in there. Let's see if we can fix it that way. Nope, we're still getting that. So X of 0. String object does not support item assignment. Okay, so that makes sense. So what we're going to do here instead is we're just going to change X altogether to H, and we're going to run that again, and we get string. So we say it's equal to string, we print it string, We call on it, we reassign to x equals h, then we print it again, and it's still string. And that matches up what we talked about before, because what's happening is if it's an immutable object, when we pass this as the argument into here, it's going to create a local variable and it's going to bind it to that. So whatever happens to it only happens within the within inside your scope of the local the function here. So you're going to be having a local variable there. So it changes it as a local variable, not as a global. So your global variable remains intact. So again, though, if we change that and we mess with it and we have a mutable object, meaning that we can change it, and then we go ahead and do something like that, then we will persist that change outside of the local function there, or the local scope of that function. So keep that in mind. So if you need to, let's say you have a mutable object and you don't want it to actually modify that, there's one trick you can do is instead of sending the list itself, you can send a copy of that list. And one tricky way of doing that is just to go ahead and do a slice here, do the open square brackets with a colon, and that's going to create a copy of my list. So you'll be working off the copy. So now when you do it, instead of having an H there, go ahead and run it, and you'll see that it's still the same thing. So none of the changes that you make inside there will persist because you're working off of a copy of that and not the actual object itself. So this, again, is one of those topics that I think is rather complex. It can throw people off when they're learning about passing by reference here and trying to figure out what's happening with the actual values. So take a moment, try to absorb that. Remember that when you're passing it as an argument, whether or not it gets changed outside, it depends on whether it's mutable or immutable. So strings, integers, things like that, they are immutable. So it's going to be working off a local copy. So it's not going to affect it at the global level there. But if that argument that's being sent in, if it's a mutable object like a list, a tuple, something like that, you're going to run into, it's going to have side effects in the sense that you're modifying that global variable there. So keep that in mind. If you absolutely positively do not want that modified and you're using a mutable object, send in a copy of it and do that using the, if you've got the list, just put the list name and then in square brackets, put a colon in there, and that's going to take the whole thing, just make a copy of it. So keep those tips in mind. Again, I'm here if you have any questions, send me an email, reach out, say you want to set up a Zoom chat, we can go over it, walk through it together. Again, when you're looking at this, try, printing out some debugging code and stuff like that, just to kind of get an idea. Use ID or type or whatever to try to figure out, what kind of things you've got there, and try to debug if your copy by assignment or your if the binding and everything isn't working the way you think it is. Try printing out the ID of it and see if it's the same as the thing that you sent in, and that'll be telling. So anyway, again, feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and I'll see you in the next lesson.